Welcome to Lecture 8 of the course Philosophy of Science for Psychologists. This lecture is about scientific realism, pragmatism, and naturalism. We started this course by thinking about knowledge. Where does knowledge come from? We have seen that one main answer is it comes from science, and then we've also seen that we struggled to find a demarcation criterion to separate science from pseudoscience. But Lakatos found basically a set of demarcation criteria. So if you use that set, it is possible to make a distinction between science and pseudoscience. But still we have a problem with the justification of our beliefs. If knowledge is justified with true belief, the problem with Lakatos' demarcation criterion of falsifiability is still, just like that was in Popper, that you can never be sure. If you have a general claim, and all sciences have general claims, then you can never be sure that it's true. You might have good reasons to believe that's true, and that's something we look at today. First, we look back to what we did last time with the alternative facts. We'll take a look at what the radical implication of constructivism and empiricism is. Then we look at scientific realism versus constructive empiricism. Constructive empiricism is an empiricism combined with a very mild version of constructivism, one might argue. It's only about the things we cannot see, like atoms and mental states. And the scientific realists argue that we can have real knowledge about them. And the constructive empiricist argues that we can't. So that's a debate that I think is interesting because it is about mental states you cannot observe. So I think that's interesting to a psychologist. With pragmatism, we'll see that we have there a very nice way of dealing with the skeptic, because we have seen so far that the skeptic asks us to justify our own knowledge, because knowledge is justified in true belief, and the skeptic says you can't justify it. And now we have looked at science, and we have come up with a set of demarcation criteria. And one of the criteria still is falsifiability, which means that any scientific statement has to be falsifiable, and therefore you can never claim 100% certainty of that claim, of that statement. And thus, you have to admit you can never have a justified and true belief. It might be a true belief, and you might have good reasons for that, but you can't justify it. So that's what we're looking at today, looking at reasons to believe something, good reasons to believe something, and to deal with the skeptic in a way that we might say, well, we have to settle for less, but still not having justified and true beliefs does not amount to skepticism. That's basically what a pragmatist argues for, at least Peirce, and that's the only pragmatist we have time to discuss. Then we'll take a look at naturalism. Naturalism agrees with the pragmatist that we shouldn't take the skeptic seriously. Then we'll take a look back at, well, maybe we shouldn't try to justify claims, but just look at how we acquire knowledge. And if we do that, then we'll see that psychology becomes really important, and that is then also immediately the part of the lecture that shows where the rest of the lectures, or the rest of the course, is about. Let's briefly recap the consequence, or one of the consequences of relativism and constructivism, and say why we don't want that. In last lecture, we saw that if you take constructivism and relativism seriously, and if you push it to its limits, then you have to accept that there are alternative facts. Different methods, different traditions generate different facts. So knowledge of facts is a sea of incompatible alternatives, as Feyerabend phrased it. So that means that if someone like Kelly and Conway says, well, we are just presenting alternative facts, when she's talking about the number of people that were at Trump's address compared to the number of people that were uh, at Obama's address, then you say, okay, uh, different facts make different sentences true. Trump is right, and it is because he has different facts than the Democratic voters had that looked at uh, the amount, the pictures and the movies of the amount of people that were at Obama's address. So this looks very much like what Feyerabend said, of course. So this is radical constructivism and radical um, relativism. And I think most people will disagree and will just say, well, Kellyanne Conway is being paid to, uh, well, help Trump at the moment he has messed up again, and well, he did immediately after. At day one he did. He lied, uh, and in the mild interpretation he was mistaken. But clearly Trump is a liar. He describes the world the way the world is not, and he does so intentionally. So, but if you're a radical constructivist and relativist, you can't make this claim. You can't say you are wrong. So you can also not say that he is wrong that ingesting bleach would get rid of COVID, because, well, it does get rid of COVID, because he has constructed the way, they have constructed the way, the world in a way that will help. And of course, that is nonsense. So clearly there is something wrong with radical constructivism and radical relativism. We have to take a look at science. And if scientists tell you bleach, injecting bleach is dangerous, don't do it. You have, we all see today that you then have very good reasons that it indeed might even be illegal. So don't do it. And Lakatos then came up with a way to distinguish science from pseudoscience by not looking at just one demarcation criterion, but looking for a set of demarcation criteria. So, and if you have a set of demarcation criteria, you can say there is science, there's pseudoscience. Pseudoscience does not provide us with knowledge. Science does. That is, we'll take a look at that today, of course. We still have to deal with the skeptic. So we are debating the skeptic and the relativists in some sense. You can also say, well, the relativists have been dealt with, the constructivists have been dealt with, there are no alternative facts, Trump and the administration are just in it for the money and the power, well, whether they tell the truth or not, that is, they're indifferent to that. They are in that sense bullshitters, as the philosopher Harry Frankfurt has it. When you're bullshitting, you're just telling anything that convinces other people in such a way that you get what you want. Money, basically. Money, power, radical right judges in the high court, even if they are stupid, if they have no knowledge whatsoever, if they are with your program, you put them where you want them. That's what they're in it. So they're bullshitting for money and power. They're not necessarily lying. If the truth is more convenient for them, they will use the truth. They will tell the truth. So we are debating those people. We are debating the relativists. We are debating the skeptics. The skeptics that say there is no knowledge possible whatsoever. Okay, now let's go to today's topics. Can we know all the objective facts? That's something the scientific realist and the constructive empiricist
disagree about.
The program of the second part first introduces the debate between the scientific realist and the constructive empiricist, and then we'll take a look at what in general scientific realists accept, because there are many different versions of scientific realism, and we'll just look at the general ideas there and what their main argument is. So all these scientific realists argue in a certain way, and that's not induction and it's not deduction. It's yet another way of reasoning that is really important for scientific thinking. So we'll take a look at that, not only because it's an argument in favor of scientific realism, but also because it's a really important way of reasoning in science. Then we'll look at arguments against scientific realism coming from constructive empiricists, and then we will evaluate those arguments. So I think the interesting thing about scientific realism for psychologists is that they claim you can have knowledge about mental states even though you don't have immediate direct access to the mental states of other human beings or of animals. So if you're interested in animal mental states, can you experience pain, for instance? We talked about it in the philosophy of mind course a little bit, but if you say, I can only have knowledge based on what I can experience myself, like an empiricist would say, then I cannot have knowledge of your mental states. And then you have to become a behaviorist, for instance. So you can still be a psychologist, but you cannot have knowledge about the internal subjective mental states. Are they real? Do they exist? A realist will say yes. So a realist in general, not just a scientific realist, but a realist in general, if someone says, I'm a realist about X, then you say, well, I think that X's exist. So if you say, I'm a realist about tables and chairs, then you say tables and chairs exist. So, okay, so that's what a realist says. Now, a scientific realist says, okay, if we look at a successful scientific theory, so a successful scientific theory is a theory that has basically a research program, a science that has a research program, of a theory that's part of a research program, that makes predictions that are falsifiable, but not falsified. They are successful in predicting future events. So they are not falsified, they are supported by empirical evidence. And then you say, well, they exist. And we're now talking about the things we cannot observe. So that's the important issue here in the scientific realism debate. So do beliefs exist? Do other mental states, the mental states of other human beings, of other animals, do they exist? And do electrons exist? You can't observe electrons with your senses. You can't observe beliefs with your senses. So, but contemporary physics postulates electrons and atoms. Contemporary psychology postulates that there are mental states, even though we cannot see them. And the scientific realist says they exist. I am a realist about mental states and about atoms. They are real. Because a successful science postulates them. So we have to take a look at the argument, of course. Why do they believe that? And I think this is interesting for psychologists, because if you can defend scientific realism, you can defend realism about mental states. So the scientific realist is an anti-constructivist. Mental states are not constructions by a theory where the theory ladenness of observation or something like that. No, they are real. The opponent is the constructivist, but not a constructivist as radical as Feyerabend or Kuhn. So given that we had critique on radical relativism and constructivism, it basically was a view that it was, even though it was popular a couple of decades ago, it's not a tenable view. And the contemporary constructivist, the constructive empiricist, will say, well, there are many theories possible. It might not actually exist, but you can also construct a second theory if you have only one theory. There are many theories possible that are empirically all equally adequate. Empirically adequate. So what does that mean? So a constructive empiricist will say we are constructivists with respect to the things we cannot observe. So the main constructive empiricist is PoSL8, and he is an empiricist. So he will not debate the existence of chairs and tables. He's a realist about tables and chairs. He's an empiricist. You can see tables, chairs, no problem there. But what about these mental states you can't observe and are postulated by psychology? What about the atoms that you can observe but are postulated by physics? So what we're debating is not the domain that we can observe with our senses. So tables, chairs, trees, other human beings, they exist. We're not debating that. So we're all realists about that. The constructive empiricist is a realist about human beings, about tables, chairs, trees, lions, mountains, planet Earth. We can observe that with our senses. So we're in agreement with that. So there's no disagreement with between the scientific realist and the constructive empiricist. And of course, there's also no disagreement in what you could call domain 4, that which in no way can be observed or detected. So observed is with your own senses, detected is via instruments, or when you use a theory, when you infer that there has to be a certain object like a black hole. You can't observe a black hole because light is so the gravity is so severe that light even doesn't reflect off it. So you can't observe it, but you can observe other things, and then you have a theory that shows, okay, there has to be a black hole over there. Similarly, you could do that with mental states. You could say, well, this and this behavior, given my theory, is indicative of mental states of a person. So you can detect or observe things. If you observe things, you do this directly with your senses. If you detect that, you do that via an instrument, a theory. So, of course, if there is something that cannot be observed or detected whatsoever, well, we're not debating that. So what are we debating? We are debating the entities postulated in science, in domain 2 and 3. So you can't observe them with your own senses, but you might use a microscope, for instance. So if you use a microscope, you can see all tiny little creatures in a drop of water. Some have been detected, so they belong to domain 2. And of course, there is still a lot to be detected. That's domain 3. Basically the same domain, but with the distinction that already things have been detected and some things haven't. So that's what the debate is about. Do viruses exist? You can't see a virus with your eyes. Do they exist? Well, a realist would say yes, and a constructive empiricist would say, well, viruses are constructions, and you can also come up with another theory that postulates something else that is empirically just as adequate, so that's just as successful in making predictions. Okay, so let's look into that debate. So, do mental states exist? Or are they just constructions postulated by a scientific theory, but, well, they might then exist or they might not exist, there might be something else. So we make predictions based on the assumption that there are mental states, but you could also have a different theory that make predictions based on the assumptions that there are not mental states, but something else that causes humans to behave in a certain way. So if you're an anti-realist, you could be agnostic, right? You could say, I don't know. There might be mental states, there might be something else. And I can always construct a theory, can always dream up a theory that is just as empirically successful, just as empirically adequate as contemporary psychology is. But it doesn't postulate mental states. Then you say, well, if you're an agnostic, maybe you shouldn't say anything about what's going on in there and just look at correlations between behavior when there is a certain stimuli. when there are certain stimuli, so stimulus-response correlations, and basically then you become a behaviorist. And of course that is totally in line with the empiricism of the logical positivists. They actually argue that you should be a behaviorist if you're a scientific psychologist. Okay, so you cannot say anything about internal subjective mental states, and therefore you might say, I'm not doing that. You also can say, well, it works. Psychology, the theory, the research program of psychologists is just an instrument in predicting and controlling behavior. Very similar to what the goal of behaviorism is, of course, was, but you might say it's a useful instrument. So I can talk about internal subjective mental states as if they are real, because if I do that, my theory makes predictions that are successful. But I have no commitment to the reality of mental states. So that's basically what we're talking about. So I do believe that it's interesting for psychologists to, well, at least look at this debate and see whether you can defend scientific realism in the sense that you say, well, I do believe that mental states do exist. And this is my argument. Because then if you're doing research into mental states, you're not doing research into something that might or might not exist. Okay, so if you can defend scientific realism, you can actually say something about the internal subjective mental lives of other people and other animals. Now, let's look at what scientific realists in general accept and what their main argument in favor of their view is. So in general, they accept the following. A scientific theory informs us about reality. Well, that's no shock. I think that's something that many scientists believe. But now we are also talking, or mainly talking, because that's the point of debate, we're talking about unobservable reality. So if you say sociology is about human beings, we can observe human beings. Do they exist? Yeah, they do exist. There's no debate about that. The debate is about, do atoms exist? Do viruses exist? Do mental states exist? Because we cannot observe that, and that's the unobservable part of reality. That there is an unobservable part of reality, that's also not being disputed. But the question is, can we have knowledge about it? Can we indeed say, we have really good reason to believe that there are atoms, mental states, and viruses? Or is there something else? And the constructive empiricist says, well, there might be something else. So the idea is that the scientific realist says, scientific theory informs us about unobservable reality, and it's by and large true. Our successful theories, successful scientific theories are by and large true. And that means that the terms, like the term atom, the term mental state, the term virus, refer to things in reality. Hence, realism, scientific realism. And that means that scientific progress is possible. If we find out what the vaccine is for COVID-19, then we have found out a little bit more about the world. So we have made scientific progress. Okay. If we find out more about the genetic deficiencies that cause autism spectrum disorder, we have made progress. So scientific progress is possible. But then you're talking about genes. Do genes exist? I can't see them. Okay, does DNA exist? Well, biology postulates it. Is it real? A realist says yes. A constructive empiricist says, I don't know. It could be something else. So the scientific realist argues that scientific progress is possible. I hope you'll see that the approximately true, the by and large true clause is there because, well, any scientific claim has to be falsifiable, runs the risk of being falsified, and scientific theories or research, scientific theories are part of research programs. We still have to do a lot of research. It's not finished. So by and large, approximately, our claims are true. Our scientific claims of successful sciences are true. And, well, we could still be wrong about something, but the majority of claims will be corresponding to the facts. Okay. So I hope you see that that's why they say approximately true. What's the way in which the scientific realist argues for their position? They use inference to the only explanation, which is a strong version of inference to the best explanation. This way of reasoning is also called abduction, and it's therefore different than induction or deduction. So we have induction, deduction, and now we have abduction. This way of reasoning is not only relevant to this argument, but to many arguments made in science of scientific thinking. Induction, deduction, we have already seen. We need to use that in science, but you also use abduction. So it's not only relevant to this debate, but you'll also, as a scientist, use that way of reasoning and, well, be critical about it. Let's take a look first at what it is and how the scientific realists use it, and then look at the arguments against this type of reasoning. And that's then relevant to this debate, but also to, well, abductive reasoning in general. Again, just like induction and deduction, this is difficult, and there will be a separate knowledge clip that replaces part of the tutorials. So take a look at that if you don't get it immediately. And I use a different example there to explain it again. So inference to the only explanation is an inference to the best explanation, where you say the best explanation is also the only explanation. So let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at first in abstracto and then give an example or a couple of examples. So inference to the best explanation is about explaining something. So there is something to be explained. Let's call that X. X is the case. You observe something and you say, I don't get it. Then you say, okay, we have several theories, several explanations, several possible explanations that all would explain X if they were true. So if A was the case, then X would be expected, but also if something else was the case, like B or C or D, X would be expected. And we have yet another explanation, explanation E, says if this and this was the case, then we would expect X. And now we say, okay, which one is the best explanation? And then you'll say, oh, it's X. And then you have to give a reason, of course, an argument in favor of E being the best explanation for X. And he says, well, it's the most probable cause. If you take a look at the probabilities, then, well, I'm pretty sure, not 100% sure, you never, I'm pretty sure that it's E. So then you say, I have a good reason to think that E was the case. You don't say, I'm absolutely certain, I have 100% proof. No, you say, I have evidence of good reasons to think that E was the case. And then E explains X. So let's take a look at an example in which we automatically go from the inference to the best explanation to the inference to the only explanation. Often what we do is we have several explanations, and then we infer, we conclude that one of them is the best, and then we basically also infer, we also conclude that's the only explanation. So then we're pretty sure. Still, you have to admit that you can never be sure about anything, but that's how we reason. So in many cases there are alternatives, but one of them clearly is the most plausible. So plausibility is one of the arguments you could give to say, well, I think that explanation is better than the others I have available. So let's give some silly, first a kind of a silly example, so you see how it works. So suppose, I can't draw, but suppose there is a detective that finds a footprint on a crime scene, so in the sand. So suppose he's on a beach, and there's a crime scene, someone has died, and we think it's murder. So there's a detective, investigation, sees a footprint. Hey, a footprint. Well, how does inference to the best explanation and inference to the only explanation that work? So hey, a footprint, we have several things to explain. We have to explain the death of this person. But if we, for the moment, assume that it was a murder, then we're looking for the murderer. And, well, then you see a footprint in the sand. That has to be explained. That's the X you were just talking about. X is there's a footprint in the sand. How do we explain that? What's the best explanation of this footprint? Then the detective might say, or think, a human walked here. Okay, I think that's the explanation we would all accept. But there are alternative explanations. If we had a cow with really weird shoes in the form of human feet, then you also would expect that form in the sand to be there. So a cow with weird shoes walked here is also an explanation of this print in the sand. Yet another is an alien walked here. Maybe some aliens have similar feet to human beings, if there are aliens at all. And if an alien with similar feet like a human walked there, then you would have the same imprints. They would have the same impression there, the same footprint. And it's on a beach, and it's windy, and there's a sea. So you could also say, well, it must have been the wind in combination with the sea. It's a random shape that looks like a human footprint. So now we have 4 explanations of the footprint, or the shape in the sand. Now we have to reason to the best explanation. Which explanation is the best? Well, I think we all would accept one as the best explanation, and actually as the only explanation. Even though that, yes, if an alien with feet like human beings would have walked there, then we might also, that would also explain this footprint, this alien footprint. But if you're watching a detective show, and that would be, and it would not be a scientific, science fiction show, it would not be the X-Files or something like that, then you would switch on off the TV, or stop watching Netflix on your telephone or laptop or whatever. You would say, well, this is nonsense. I've had it with this detective series. So is it allowed to argue, to say, well, I only accept statement 1? Well, then you have to argue why it is that you accept that and not the other explanations. Why not even come up with the other explanations? You might not even think of, well, a cow with weird shoes. You probably have never thought that seeing a detective show on television, that you say, why doesn't he, this detective is stupid, why doesn't he come up with this alternative explanation that a cow with strange shoes had walked there? That's not something you do. You don't even think about these strange explanations, even though, if it would be the case, it would be the explanation. So it's not impossible. So what do? You need to find good reasons to accept an explanation. Parsimony, for instance, the principle of Occam's razor. You don't postulate more entities than you need in a theory. Coherence with what you already know. We have really good reasons to think that even if aliens exist, they have never visited Earth. So the explanation with the alien, well, really implausible. And explanatory power, of course, is also something that is important. So the last one, it's the sand and the sea, and also the cow with the shoes, has not much explanatory power. Maybe it can explain the prints in the sand, but it would not explain the person lying there with a knife in his heart. So postulating a human being that is actually a murderer would, and well, an alien would be capable of murder as well, probably. But if you look at these types of arguments, then you see, okay, yeah, well, even though we can't rule out with 100% certainty the other explanations, this one is the best. This one is actually the only one I'm going to accept. And that's also you see in the scientific realism debate. So let's take a look at that. So we now have seen what influence to the best explanation, what influence to the only explanation is, what abductive reasoning is. So you reason to a explanation of a phenomenon you have observed. And now there is a different phenomenon to be explained. So we are talking about scientific theories that are about the unobservable part of reality. Be it psychology, that says something about mental states you can't observe. Be it biology, that says something about viruses you can't observe. Be it physics, that says something about molecules and atoms you can't observe. So now they do make predictions, right? As a psychologist, based on the postulation of mental states, you predict certain behavior. A physicist would say, well, we have atoms, our theory tells us you can split atoms and that would generate a lot of energy. So if we do that so and so and so, then we should be able to turn on the light. In the end, so you build a nuclear power plant, and that's all at the level of the observable, right? You can see the behavior displayed by human beings you predict as a psychologist. And you can see the light going on the moment you build once you've built a nuclear power plant, etc., and all the things you need for that. That's at the observable level. So the prediction, the success of these scientific theories is at a level of the predictions you actually can observe with your own eyes. So you can observe that, well, if you use EMDR people, with people with post-traumatic stress disorder, you can observe that after that they display different behavior. Okay, but it postulates that there is a working memory in which you have all kinds of mental states, etc. So you postulate all kinds of mental states and you predict certain behavior. You postulate atoms, you can't see them, and you predict certain phenomena taking place at the observable level. So, and then you say, okay, how can we explain it? How can we explain the success of psychology? How can we explain the success of biology? How can we explain the success of physics? When they postulate all these things we cannot observe. So the explanation, or the phenomenon that needs explanation is the success of science. It's about the sciences that postulate things that we cannot observe. Now let's come up with some explanations. Just like with the footprint, we have several possible explanations. The first one, it's all a big coincidence. Actually, there are no mental states, there are no electrons, there are no viruses, but if we act as if they exist, then the predictions of our scientific theories, of these research programs of which theories are part, they are successful. So we postulate mental states, we postulate atoms, we postulate viruses, they don't really exist. There is something unobservable, there exist unobservables, but they're not mental states, they're not viruses, they're not atoms. Still, if you postulate them, the theory works as a good instrument for predicting the events in the observable world. However, the things postulated by the theories do not really exist. Basically, we have the wrong theory about the unobservable reality of the wrong theories about unobservable reality. That's one explanation, and that doesn't have much explanatory power, I think. The second one is God takes care of this, so there are no molecules, there are no mental states, there are no viruses, but God's a really nice guy, and if we postulate these things, he makes our predictions come true. Or if you say, well, that's fooling someone, it's an evil demon. An evil demon takes care of it. There isn't even a reality. We're all like Descartes prior to his proof of the existence of God. We all live in this virtual reality in which we think There's even a physical world that might not be there. Well, that's not up for debate in the debate between the scientific realist and the constructive empiricist. But if we're talking about the unobservable reality, I might believe that there are mental states. I might believe that there are atoms, and it's an evil demon that makes my predictions come true. Okay. The last one is that the world is approximately, again, all claims are falsifiable, so they might be wrong, but we have a lot of empirical support in favor of it because, well, we're talking about a successful science here. The world is by and large the way theories say that the world is. So psychology postulates mental states, and that's by and large true. There are mental states. Physics postulates atoms, and that's by and large true. There are atoms. Biology claims that there are, or postulates that there are viruses, and yes, there are viruses. Are there other explanations? Maybe you can come up with one. The thing now is we can come up with all kinds of explanations of X, in this case, the success of sciences that postulate things we cannot observe and are successful at the level of the observable. And we would only accept 4. That is, most people would only accept 4. That is what a scientific realist would say. Because that provides insight into why a scientific theory is successful. And that's why Hilary Putnam says, I believe realism is the only philosophy that doesn't make the success of science a miracle. Because it has explanatory power. The world is the way science tells us. And if we are right about the world, yeah, no wonder our predictions are successful. But if the scientists are wrong about the world, about the unobservable part of the world, then it's a miracle how we can have predictions at the observable level that are actually successful. Viruses don't exist, but if we make a vaccine, which also doesn't exist, well, that is, there's a liquid, and you put it in your veins or something like that, and then you get rid of all these nasty symptoms you have. But that's not because you eradicated the virus. It's due to there being something else. Well, I don't know how this works then. So explanatory power here is really a reason to believe that viruses, mental states, and atoms actually exist. If you accept one of the other explanations, you still need to explain how that works. How does God do it? How does the evil demon do it? And how come that even though we were wrong, our predictions are correct? If we want to explain that, you basically need to know what the correct theory is and compare them and say, ah, yeah, now I understand. But without that, it has no explanatory power at all. So it would be a miracle that our predictions at the observable level, based on the postulation of mental states, for instance, are successful. Right, so I think you understand that you should know what induction, deduction, and now abduction are. Make sure you know the structure of these different types of reasoning. You can provide examples, and also you can explain what, if anything, is wrong with them. Again, there is a tutorial in which I discuss induction, deduction, and abduction in one knowledge clip. Okay, so let's look at some arguments against scientific realism and the evaluation of these arguments. So the arguments are basically aimed at showing that there's something wrong with abduction, with abductive reasoning, with inference to the best explanation, inference to the only explanation. So what are these counter-arguments, or what are some of these arguments? The first argument claims that scientific theory only needs to be empirically adequate. That means if you have a theory about the world, what do you want it to do? Well, you want it to make predictions about the world, and those predictions, of course, pertain to the world we can observe. So that is what empirically adequate means. So you make falsifiable predictions, and the predictions are not falsified, but they come true. They are successful. So you want to make predictions that are successful. So that's what you want. So if you take a look back at what Watson said when he wrote about behaviorism, the aim of psychology is the prediction and control of behavior. And a behavior that's something you can observe. So here too, you would say that's all you need to do. A behaviorist theory, a psychological theory, only needs to describe behavior under certain circumstances. So if you change the circumstances in therapy or something like that, then the behavior changes. Okay, so that's all you need to know. That's all you're aiming for. And then you could be like a behaviorist saying, well, what's going on inside the black box? I don't know. I don't even say anything about it. Or you could go like the constructive empiricist. You might say, well, we have constructed this theory in which we postulated all kinds of mental entities. So even though you can't observe them, you can talk about them, and you can use them to make predictions about the reality, about behavior you can observe. But I have no commitment to the truth of the theory. I have no commitment to the claim that the mental entities in this case that are postulated by the theory actually exist, that the terms refer to actually things inside minds of humans and animals. So you do not have to commit to the truth. You could be agnostic about what the theory is postulating, while still use the theory, to predict behavior, for instance. So that's the first counter argument. A theory only needs to be empirically adequate. Why would I want anything more? Well, is that all you want? Do you want to have a good tool? Because that's basically what it is. It becomes an instrument, a scientific theory about the unobservable reality becomes an instrument to predict what happens under certain circumstances at the observable level. Is that what you want to do? Well, that is at least also what you want to do, but isn't it true that many scientists actually want to know what explains the phenomena, what explains certain types of behavior? And if you then have to postulate mental entities or genes, DNA, to make the predictions, don't you also believe that the theory actually describes the world the way the world is? So if you want a real explanation, if you want more than just prediction, you probably need to make stronger claims than that a scientific theory is just an instrument. A second counter-argument, and that I think is a problem with, it shows a problem with abduction in general, is, okay, so you have a lot of explanations and you reason to the best one. You infer which one is the best based on plausibility, possibility, explanatory power, parsimony, simplicity. There are all kinds of epistemic reasons why you choose one theory, one explanation over another. But what, and this also becomes important when you're a detective, or when you're doing forensic psychology. What if you do not come up with the proper explanation? So you want to explain X, you have explanation A, B, C, D, and E, and all would explain X. And then you say, well, I think E is the best explanation, so I accept that. What if the proper explanation was F? So what if an inference to the best explanation is an inference to the best of a bad lot of explanations? That's one of the arguments of PoSL8 against scientific realism. So that is a problem. And then you could argue, okay, so what type of argument is that? You could say, okay, I really do want to explain human behavior, and therefore I need to make a commitment to the truth, or to the truth of the claims made by psychology about the unobservable part of reality, about the mental states of other human beings, and similar arguments could be made for a biologist and a physicist. So, and then you can say, well, I do not know where they exist, so I am an agnostic. I do not have a commitment to the truth of that. And then you could argue that, at least at that level, the constructivist empiricist takes the skeptic too seriously. So again, the skeptic says, how do you know? And you say, I do not know. And I refrain from making claims about the world. So indeed, you could say you're giving too much credit to the skeptic. We have very good reasons to believe that mental states indeed exist. We have very good reasons to believe that atoms and molecules exist and that viruses exist. That's what a scientific realist would say. So maybe we could come up with a way to at least, maybe this argument against constructive empiricism, taking the skeptic too seriously, maybe you don't find that a good argument, but still it is something that is still in play. This skeptic that presses you for giving justifications, and if you say I can't give a justification, then you say I'm an agnostic. Maybe we could make stronger claims about the truth of scientific claims, even though we cannot justify them. So even though we cannot give an explanation or something like that, that shows that we're 100% sure. So maybe we should address this problem of the skeptic. Maybe we should address this demand of the skeptic for a justification. And the conclusion of the skeptic, that if you can't give a justification, then you should be an agnostic. Refrain from making claims about the world. So maybe there's something in between making claims that you say I'm 100% certain, and okay, if I'm not 100% certain, I'm not certain, and therefore I have no knowledge, and therefore I will not say anything about the world. I refrain from making claims. So that's what we'll do in a moment. So in this debate I think is still going on. Are realist, anti-realist. It's certainly a topic in philosophy of science of the last couple of decades, and so we have now arrived at contemporary philosophy of science. And in a moment we'll do a step back and then go to another type of contemporary philosophy of science, contemporary epistemology, if you wish. So with debate between the constructive empiricist and the scientific realist, one of the issues again was skepticism, one could argue. So let's look at pragmatism, a different view, and that has an original way to deal with the skeptic. We've seen that the skeptic argues that we can never have a justification for our beliefs. And we also have seen that the skeptic has been right so far. And it looks like he always will be right, because if we look at science, and then we have seen in the analysis of science that all sciences use general claims to make predictions about individuals and events. So that's what you need in science. Also, we saw in the criticism on Popper that if you identify a swan as a black swan, you still identify it as a swan, and that basically implies that you use a category, a universal, something that's also general, just like a law, to identify that individual falling under in that category. So basically, we use concepts, general concepts, we use general laws, and this means that we always will have the problem of induction as long as we are honest and we make our general claims falsifiable. Because then you have claims like all A's are B, and you're never 100% sure. And that, of course, is the problem. The skeptic would say, oh, so then you do not have knowledge, because knowledge is a justified and true belief. So we can never get that. So the skeptic seems to be right. How should we proceed? How to deal with this? We already have seen in the first part of this lecture that you can say, well, I have good reasons to believe a claim. And then you have supporting evidence. But the skeptic, of course, would say, well, yeah, that's just having inductive evidence for a general claim. So you don't know. Nobody have good reasons. So there seems to be something in between saying you know nothing, what the skeptic does, and saying I have knowledge in the sense that you know you are 100% sure, you have a justification for your beliefs. I think we are more sure about many beliefs than not having knowledge, but not as sure as having an actual justification. So that's basically how science works. We have seen that. How science works. We have seen that in the previous lectures. So let's ask this question, why do we want to have knowledge? Okay, we want to have knowledge because you can do something with it. We want to understand society, so we want to have knowledge about society at this university, but in general we want to understand the world, and then we want to make the world a little bit better, so we want to advance society. As a psychologist, you might want to help people with mental problems, for instance. So knowledge serves a goal. And we act based on our knowledge, and this becomes very apparent in pragmatism. So let's take a look at that. We only have time to look at just one pragmatist, so we're going to look at Charles Sanders Peirce. Peirce writes about beliefs. He goes to definition by Bain. We're not going to obey that, but that's what he did. He says, Bain's definition of belief is the following: that upon which a man is prepared to act. So it is a mental state someone is basing their actions on. And from this definition, basically pragmatism follows. So this is basically what pragmatism is, and the rest is just working out the details. So what a pragmatist does is a pragmatist couples knowledge, or maybe we should talk about beliefs, to actions. And if you see someone act, you can see what their beliefs are. So, well, I take a sip of this. You can infer what my belief is. You will believe that I believe that there's coffee or at least a drinkable liquid in it. So you can infer that, and I base my actions on my belief. I believe that there's coffee in it. I also believe that I'm thirsty and I need coffee, I need caffeine, so I take another sip. Okay, so that's the connection between beliefs and actions. And in this way, you can say, okay, I am sure enough that there is no poison in my coffee. I'm not 100% sure. Do I know that there is no poison in my coffee? No, I don't know that. Someone could have put poison in the coffee, so I made a cup of coffee a couple of minutes ago, and now there's poison in my cup. Do I believe that? Unless I'm suicidal, I don't. So, and I can tell you I'm not suicidal. So, I do not believe that there is poison in the cup, Or, in other words, I do believe there is no poison in the cup. So you can infer that from my actions. And do I have knowledge? No, but I am sure enough to base my actions on it. And that's basically what his definition of belief is. I'm sure enough to base my actions on it. So if I put my money on it, is there poison in it or not? Then I say there's no poison in it. Okay. So, and then you have trust in your beliefs. That is different from being 100% certain, but you're sure enough to base your actions on. So I don't doubt it. I don't doubt that the coffee is drinkable. Now let's go back to Descartes, because Descartes said, well, I will try to fight the skeptic with his own method, that is the method of radical doubt. And if I use the method of radical doubt, so I have all these beliefs, and I'm going to doubt all my beliefs and see, okay, if I can doubt a belief, then it's not knowledge, and I'm not going to believe it anymore. So, and then he hoped that in the end he'll have a belief that when he tried to doubt it, he couldn't actually doubt it, and that was the cogito that I think therefore I am. So this was a pretty good strategy, of course. If you say I'm out to find justified and true beliefs, and any belief that can be doubted can't be a justified and true belief. It might be a true belief, but I can't justify it. So it's not knowledge, and I'm looking for knowledge. I'm looking to refute the skeptic. Then this is a very good method, at least to find the cogito. Now, Peirce asked, you could ask the question, did Descartes have real doubts? Charles Sanders Peirce says, no, I don't think so. And therefore he makes a distinction between paper doubt, so doubt on paper. I doubt that there is a physical world. I don't doubt that, but I can write it down. Descartes didn't doubt it, but he wrote it down. And living doubt. And living doubt is real doubt. That's the real doubt. Then you really doubt your beliefs. Descartes' doubt was just paper doubt. And Descartes, I think, he never phrased it like Peirce did, but Descartes would certainly agree, because he says, well, you doubt things, but so when you do this thought experiment, this meditation on doubting your own beliefs, then at the end of the first meditation, so he wrote this in the meditations, 6 meditations, 1 for each day, and then the 7th day you have to rest, of course, being a good Catholic. So, and at the end of the first meditation is the end of the first day, and then he has doubted all his former beliefs, in theory, on paper. And then he writes things like, okay, so this is the end of the day, I'm now going to sleep. And he doesn't doubt he has a bed, and he has a body, and things like that. So he doesn't doubt the physical world. And in another book, he actually writes, so this is something you do in theory, but not in practice. So it's theoretical doubt, not practical doubt. So I think Descartes would agree with Peirce. So what's this doubt on paper? I can say, for instance, well, there's no one in a lecture hall now. This would be my go-to example when I would be in front of you live. So I could say, I think you're not existing. I can write it down. I've actually done this. I think you do not exist is on this line. Okay, I can doubt your existence. All the students that are watching this movie do not exist. Ah, okay. But do I really believe that you do not exist? No, I don't. Because why would I make this video? Or if there's no corona crisis, why would I lecture to a hall full of students that might just be there only in my imagination, or an evil demon has made this virtual reality or something like that? You can infer from my actions from making this video and in normal situations, lecturing live in a classroom, that I believe that you all exist. I do not really doubt that, but I can write it down on paper or on a PowerPoint slide. Yeah, and that's paper doubt. I don't really doubt it because in my actions you'll see that I don't doubt your existence, but I can do that. It's not that hard, it's just 6 words. I think you do not exist. I write it down. But I don't really doubt that. Descartes didn't really doubt it. And Descartes, of course, never said he really did that. It was just his strategy to deal with the skeptic. And Peirce is going to show, well, there is basically in the work of Descartes is already this distinction between these two types of doubt, or at least in Descartes is this methodological doubt, this theoretical doubt, which is apparently no real doubt. Descartes says don't really doubt your beliefs when you have to eat food or something like that. Don't doubt that the bread will feed you. Just eat. So Descartes had only papered out when he did his experiment, his thought experiment of, well, what I'm sure about, this meditation, this thought exercise. So clearly Descartes would have agreed that he only doubted it on paper, and the question, of course, is whether he would agree with the second part of the analysis of Peirce, that is, that there is also living doubt, and that living doubt is real doubt. So this is doubt that feels uncomfortable. It's annoying, it's irritating. So he's talking about the irritation of doubt. And what is so irritating about living doubt? Well, you have a belief, or you have all your beliefs in a set of beliefs, and your beliefs are that upon which you are prepared to act. And now you're really doubting one or more of your beliefs. Really doubting, not just on paper, but you're really doubting. For instance, well, take a bit of a horrible example, but someone has had a terrible accident, one of your friends or a family, and is in the hospital and is not responding to stimuli. He's on all kinds of machines for breathing, etc. So he is in what we in layman terms call a coma. So it could be anything, of course. Vegetative state, locked-in syndrome. There are different types of, well, situations that could be possible in this case. And then you say, well, what should I do? Should I read to this person? Because this person still hears me, or this person might be an organ donor. Maybe you should say, well, it's really sad, but help other people. So then you don't know what to do, and that's annoying, that's irritating, it feels uncomfortable. So that's basically what it is. Your belief is something which you are prepared to act upon, and if you can't act upon your belief because you're really doubting, it's living doubt, then, well, you want to get rid of the doubt in order to act again. So there's this really close connection between beliefs and action. So what you need to do is you want to fixate your beliefs. That's the phrase Peirce uses. You want to have a belief in such a way that you are willing to base your actions upon that. And so we're not talking about an actual justification, but sure enough that you will act upon it. So in this horror scenario, you need to be able to tell well, the medical staff, well, yes, leave the machines on because I really believe that this person that I love will get better. Okay, how do you get to that belief? So how do we fixate our beliefs? Well, there are 4 methods Peirce discusses. all have arguments in favor, and the first three have arguments against them, and obviously it's going to be the scientific method that has no arguments against them. So let's look at them, and let's see what the arguments in favor and against them are, and how that then pertains to science in the end. So there's this method of tenacity. Basically, this is not a way to fixate your belief again. So you're doubting a belief and you are looking for a way to find a new belief to act upon. Basically, this is a way to stick to your beliefs. So it is, in a sense, a way of fixating your beliefs because you don't doubt them. So you stay away from those things that possibly might bring you to doubt anything. So you stay away from other people, you stay away from books, you stay away from your mobile phone, from TV, from radio, from newspapers, anything that might actually get you to doubt your beliefs. And when we're talking about doubt now in this this part of the lecture, we are talking about living doubt. We're not talking about paper doubt, we're talking about living doubt. So if you really doubt something, then you don't know what to do. So of course you can try to stay away from those stimuli that might cause you to actually doubt your beliefs. Versus this is socially impossible. The social impulse is against it. You would have to become a hermit, and even then you might stumble upon a situation in which you don't know what to do. So you should stay away from all human beings. That is the very least thing you should do if you want to stick to your beliefs no matter what. Well, that's impossible if you are dealing with other human beings, because they have different beliefs. They might show you that you're wrong, and then you have living doubt. So that's the first method, and there's the social impulse again. Now, the second one is, you use the method of authority. If you're really doubting, you ask the person everyone else in your society is telling you that he or she is an expert, that he's an authority. So you ask, so the person is really thinking about a priest, a person like that. Why are you asking the priest? Well, everybody does. So you're now in a social community, right? So in the previous method, the method of tenacity, sticking to your beliefs, you stay away from other people, and that's, practically impossible, and certainly we can't all do that. So we live in societies, and in societies we have people that we trust, that we think are authorities on certain subjects, on certain topics. But if you live in a society and you see other people in different societies, you're the neighboring town or another country, then there will always be people in our own society that wonder why we believe what we believe and not have the beliefs of our neighbors. And if you're thinking about religion, then you can say, well, why do we believe this? And in the other country they believe different things. We believe in one God, they believe in multiple gods. Why don't we believe that? Because they all do. So people get critical on authority if you can't explain to them why you should believe that. Yeah, well, it's in the book. Yeah, well, but they have a different book. Why believe this book? It's the Word of God. Yeah, but they are saying that's the book they have are the words of the gods. So I don't see it. So there will always be people that are critical of claims made by authorities without proper arguments. And then there is the a priori method. So, and here you see the method that Descartes used when he used his own method, so the method of clear and distinct insight. So you yourself look for those truths which are indisputable. You can't doubt them, and then take it from there. So basically that's what Descartes did. I can doubt everything. Yes, I can. Even though it's paper doubt, I can doubt just one thing. There's one thing I cannot doubt, which is I think therefore I am. So this is a priori. You do this based on thinking alone, not doing research out there in the world, because the world might not exist on paper. So if you really doubt something, so now if it's living doubt, you also need to do this. You have to think for yourself, come up with an a priori method, and then see what you believe. And then Peirce says, well, if you do that, that's similar to taste. It's subjective. Why do you think something is a priori true, and why don't I believe that? So, of course, we have seen in the method of Descartes, when he says, I have a clear, distinct insight, well, even religious people say, well, I don't see your argument in favor of the existence of God based on the clear, distinct insight. Some might, but many don't. So then indeed, it is quite subjective what you think is a priori true or not. And if it's subjective, then you might still believe something different from what I believe and from what a third person believes, etc. So this is not a good way to fixate your beliefs, because you will doubt them again later, or you will not convince other people. So if you have to convince other people, because so this is an order of belief fixation. So the problem with the previous belief fixation method of that of authority was that you refer to society, you refer to authorities in society, and you yourself didn't say why we all believe this. And here, of course, we need a method then that shows to you why you should believe it, but also to others, of course. And that doesn't work here. So it becomes highly subjective. And of course, you need an objective theory. And that's what? That's the last method. The scientific method provides knowledge that's independent of my taste and applies to everyone. So the idea is, if you use the method of science, and here we see the same reason and the same arguments as we saw in the positivism, the logical positivist Popper. If we all use the same method, and we did not choose for that, it turns out to be the best method, it has the best track record, well, then we in the end will all come up with the same beliefs. So it's independent of me, it works for you just as well as for me. So then we'll have a manner of fixating our beliefs. That's an objective manner, that's the best method we have. And clearly there's a realistic assumption behind this idea, that there is a physical world and there are other people. So that's not what we're debating right now, because who really doubts seriously that the world exists? Not even a skeptic would do that, Peirce would argue, because a skeptic would be just like Descartes. He says to Descartes, the skeptic says to Descartes, what's your justification? I don't see a justification, and therefore you don't have knowledge. Well, if the skeptic addresses Descartes, then he has already acknowledged the existence of Descartes, or he has already said that from his actions it follows that he believes that Descartes exists and that he doesn't doubt it, at least not living doubt. So this implies that there is a world that exists independently of us and that we gain knowledge about this world, and we should do this in the manner that science tells us, because it's the best way to finding out what the world is. So what is it that we find out when we use the scientific method? What is it that we find out about the world? Well, we find out what the effects are of events in the world, of things in the world. So if we have a concept of something, like the concept of a cup, then we find out, if we do scientific research, if we do research into the world, then we'll find out what all the causal relations are of a cup. So what you can do with it, or what it can do. It's the same goes for a heart. So a heart, what is it? You can find out all the causal relations, all the causal things, all the things it does. And the pragmatic maxim says, well, our conception of the effects of a cup, that's all there is to know about an object. And this looks very much like we have seen earlier in Hume, for instance. If we think about the matters of fact, if we think about the objects, the things, the events in the world, then we do that using causality. And Peirce says something similar, and he defines this in the pragmatic maxim, the pragmatic rule on what you find out about the world if you do proper science. Now, does that provide us with certain knowledge? No, it doesn't. But it makes action possible again. And of course, since you're not certain 100%, it might be the case that at a later stage you will again have living doubt with respect to your beliefs, or one of your beliefs, or some of your beliefs. But for the moment, you'll trust your beliefs. You have a sufficient reason to believe that they are true. You're not 100% sure. It's not a justified and true belief, but it's a belief of which you have good reason to believe that it's true. You don't have the irritation of doubt, so you don't have living doubt. And that means that the skeptic in some way has been refuted, because the skeptic will say, I'll claim not to have knowledge when I'm not 100% certain, when I don't have a proper justification, and then I refrain from making any judgment about the world. Well, the pragmatist would say, that's impractical. You have to make judgments about the world. And actually, skeptic, you're doing that as well. You're drinking your coffee. So that implies that you believe there's no poison in your coffee, unless you want to die. But usually you show all kinds of beliefs, and in this case, it's the belief that there's no poison in your coffee. You also believe that. You might not be 100% sure, but you act based on that belief. So you're not refraining from judgment about the world. You are, in your actions, it shows you are making claims about the world. This also means, and we have seen it already in Popper, of course, that knowledge is always provisional. All the things we believe to be knowledge it's always provisional. The beliefs we have, which we think they are true, we have good reasons to believe they are true, it's always provisional. And that, of course, is a big problem. That is, if you don't see that, if you think science provides you with irrefutable claims, even though they are phrased in a falsifiable way, and many people do have this belief, many people believe that science provides us with proof instead of with evidence, then they have misconceptions about science. And if you have misconceptions about science, then the next time science has it wrong, trust in science fades. And then you get people that become anti-vaxxers or something like that. So it's really dangerous to have this misconception about what science is doing, what science is actually doing. And in these lectures, I hope I have convinced you that science is our best method to provide knowledge about the world, to find out what the world is, but it's fallible. human beings are fallible, and scientists will always make falsifiable claims. So no scientist will say, I know for 100% sure that, and then make a claim. No scientist will do that. What you see on TV and in magazines and on YouTube is people portraying scientists saying as, we have proof. So I hope that at least you take that from this course, that you are not going to do that. You're not going to make that mistake. You're not going to contribute to this misconception of science. Okay. View closely related to pragmatism is that of naturalism. And if we look at naturalism, we'll see that psychology becomes really important, maybe the most important science for epistemology, for philosophy of science, and all the other sciences. We look at the work of Quine, Willard van Orman Quine. He was an empiricist, just so you know where to place him in the debates. We'll not discuss his empiricism. We have done enough empiricism. He is also a naturalist, and that's what I want to talk to you about now. He is a naturalist, and naturalism is a view that shows how important psychology is for epistemology, philosophy of science, and for all the other sciences. So psychology is not just important to psychologists, but also to physicists and historians and economists. We'll see that in a moment. So what is naturalism? Naturalism, you could say, is a very concise philosophy that says, well, we think about human beings as naturally evolved creatures, and that has consequences for the way we answer certain questions, or maybe for all questions. And especially when it's about philosophical questions, about knowledge and science, and we see you get a course in philosophy of science, and we start with epistemology, and we're philosophers that we're talking about knowledge, but of course scientists are the actual persons that gather knowledge, that acquire knowledge. So the idea of naturalism is that there is not so much a distinction between science and philosophy. And if you take a look back at those philosophers we've discussed, like Aristotle, for instance, was he a philosopher? Yeah, he thought about questions we now categorize as philosophical questions, like questions on ethics and epistemology, but he also was a biologist and he was a linguist. So he wrote about how to write, and he wrote about poetry, and he wrote about politics, and he wrote about classification system for plants and animals. So this distinction between philosophy and science is something that's quite new. If you take a look at Descartes, 17th century, we say he's a philosopher. Well, he was also a mathematician. He was also a physicist. He was also doing research into medicine. So this distinction seems to come with the universities and teaching of subjects, and then you get rid of all the scientific stuff. So physics becomes a separate department, biology becomes a separate department, and what's left is philosophy. And now a naturalist like Quine says, even though there are questions that are classified traditionally as philosophical, like what's good and where does knowledge come from and stuff like that, those are also scientific questions. And we have to answer them by looking at science. As a philosophy of science, naturalism is quite the minimalist philosophy. It basically says, if you have a question, it's a scientific question. If you have a problem, it's a scientific problem. We should study science using science. If you have a question on ethics, it is in the end a scientific question. If you have a question on epistemology, it's a scientific question. And we should use science thus to answer these questions. So that's basically what it says. Now, we have seen that Descartes and the British empiricists had this idea that you have some kind of foundation in your if you use the metaphor of knowledge as a building, you have a foundation where you are absolutely certain about, and from that the rest follows. You try to have a method that provides you with absolutely sure knowledge with justified and true beliefs. And Quine says, well, clearly that didn't work, and he says, well, the last attempt to justify scientific beliefs, scientific statements, came from Carnap, a logical positivist, a good friend of Quine, and he said he failed to do so. And Carnap himself argued that he failed to do so. He wrote a book about it in German, and then when the publisher wanted to translate it into English, he said, well, don't do it because, well, it didn't work. So Quine argues we cannot justify knowledge or science, scientific claims in this way. It's not possible to do that. And then he kind of gives up on that project. And that is interesting, I think. He says it's not a bad thing. Should we then conclude that because we cannot have absolute certain knowledge, we have to give up on epistemology, on philosophy of science, on science? And he says, no. If we want to know more about science, we just look at science. And if we are interested in epistemology, in the source of knowledge, how we gain knowledge, where knowledge comes from, the acquisition of knowledge, we should look at psychology, because psychology is in the business of finding out how we learn, how we acquire knowledge. And these days, I think you might also add neuroscience. So back when Quine wrote that, neuroscience wasn't as big as it has become in the last couple of decades. So Quine then says, if we're thinking about epistemology, if we're thinking about knowledge, why not settle for psychology? Why not do psychology instead of philosophy? And then, of course, if you're a philosopher looking at psychology, you'll see that this distinction between philosophy and psychology becomes, well, kind of blurred. Because, well, if you're a philosopher that is a naturalist philosopher, then you look at science. So, yeah, you're not just thinking about the world and how it might be and all these metaphysical questions. Why is there something rather than nothing and stuff like that? No, you say, where does knowledge come from? Well, I can think about it a lot, but I can also actually look at the persons that do actual research into that topic. And then Quine says, previously, this was not allowed. Such a surrender of the epistemological burden to psychology is a move that was disallowed in earlier times, because it was circular reasoning. Now, why does he say that? He says, okay, if you say knowledge is justified in true belief, and then you have, for instance, a psychologist that claims to have knowledge, then how do you justify that knowledge? Okay, that's epistemological question. You're in the business of trying to find a justification, and you might say, well, you try the empiricist way, or the rationalist way. And Quine says, no. What I'm trying to do when I look at how the psychologist acquires knowledge is look at psychology. And if you now think that he tries to justify the claims of the psychologist by referring to psychology, then it becomes circular, of course. Then you say, well, how do I know that what the psychologist says is true? Well, the psychologist has this theory about knowledge acquisition, and that justifies what they say about knowledge acquisition. Well, that's circular. But he's not doing that. he is giving up on this project of finding a justification. We just look at how do we actually acquire new beliefs? How do we acquire things we believe are true about the world? So if the epistemologist's goal is a validation of the grounds of empirical science, well, and that doesn't work. However, if we don't do that, then the argument of circularity doesn't go anymore. So once we have stopped dreaming of deducing science from observation, that would be the empiricist way, right? You have the observation, you have the experiences, and you're absolutely certain about that, and then you deduce the rest from that. So if that doesn't work, you give up on the project of justification of scientific claims. Then you can still look at how scientists actually acquire new beliefs that they think are true about the world. So the goal has changed. We no longer want to justify knowledge. We want to know how people acquire knowledge about the world, and also what the possible mistakes are they might make. Because we already have seen things like the theory lateness of observation. It might not be as radical as Kuhn and Fire, I would say, but you can be mistaken. So that was what Jastrow was pointing at. If you walk in a dark forest and you see a tree that has a white bark, and you interpret that as a ghost, well, then you have made a mistake. So if we want to know how we acquire knowledge and how we make mistakes, then you have a different goal from trying to justify your beliefs. You're just trying to see how it actually works. And that is called naturalized epistemology, or epistemology naturalized. So this is replacing the traditional epistemology, what we've been doing. We're talking only about knowledge, with a psychological study of how we reason, how we acquire knowledge. So, and then it's not something of psychology anymore. It's something of science. Epistemology belongs to science, it belongs to psychology. It becomes a chapter in psychology, Quine says. So psychology is doing a lot more, of course, but part of psychology is finding out what our biases are, for instance. That is naturalized epistemology. And then we learn a lot about knowledge acquisition. I hope you see that this is very much in line with Bacon and another empiricist, Hume, because even though there was no psychology back then, as a science, there was no discipline called psychology, but Hume was talking about the science of man, for instance, but he meant psychology. That is, he refers to something that didn't exist as psychology, of course, but he meant just that, looking at the study of how we think, and that's part of psychology. So Hume argued that there is no certain knowledge because we do not have 100% certain knowledge about causal relations. We use induction. And why do we use induction? Well, that is just the way our psyche works, our mind works. So take taste aversion again, I think I referred to that in a previous lecture. If you eat something and it makes you ill, even though it might not be the case, just one time is enough not to eat that food, at least for quite some time. So you won't eat it. You ate Brussels sprouts for the very first time in your life and you got sick. Well, next time there are Brussels sprouts, you won't eat them. Just order something else, make something else, buy something else. Better safe than sorry. But this is induction. Maybe you didn't get sick from the Brussels sprouts. Maybe you got sick from, well, I don't know, the coffee you were drinking. So you made this mistake. But we are induction machines. Bacon basically says the same thing, and he sums up a lot of idols, epistemological prejudices we have as human beings belonging to a part of a group. They may stand in the way of finding out the way the world is, of acquiring knowledge. So Bacon and Hume defended this type of naturalized epistemology avant la lettre, prior to actually existing in terms like those of Willard Van Orman Quine. So for instance, look at what we looked at in lecture 2, the idols of the tribe. So these are the prejudices, the epistemological prejudices we have as human beings. And that is, we tend to we infer things about the world. We do this automatically. So it's like a visual illusion, things like that. Seeing regularity where there is none. So basically induction, and induction of course works in a lot of cases. So we have these idols, and of course Bacon could not give an evolutionary explanation of them, living way before Darwin did. But we can understand why we have them, because they work. They are very convenient in our natural environment. If in your natural environment you got ill from eating something, it probably was because there were bacteria in them or something like that, or there were toxins in them. And you don't need to know anything about bacteria and toxins not to eat that food anymore, because you gotten ill. And next time you'll eat the same stuff, you might even die. Who knows? So don't eat it. So seeing regularity where it might not be there, where it might be there or not, is a better safe than sorry mechanism. So, and you do this automatically. So this is we can't get rid of our idols because they work. But we might be warned against the mistakes we make because they do not work in all contexts, and especially in the context of science, of finding out the facts in ways that are different from the ways we use in our natural environment on the savannah, for instance. Well, then you might make mistakes. What can we conclude of today's lecture? Main conclusion of today's lecture, but also of previous lectures, of course, is that nothing is certain. We can never be 100% certain about anything. So you should not claim that as a scientist. So, but that does not imply that we should become skeptics and say that we do not know anything at all, or that we can't make claims about the world. We do, and we should do. So in science, every claim is, in some sense, a conjecture, and of course you accept your claim only if you have evidence in favor for it, but the evidence does never amount to proof. So we will never have knowledge in the sense of 100% sure, 100% justified true beliefs. But it doesn't amount to skepticism, because a skeptic also doesn't really doubt their beliefs. And that is because there are always good reasons to believe something. And if they're not, then you have living doubt, then you don't know what to believe. But there are good reasons to believe certain things. Like, what's the cause of an autism spectrum disorder? We have really good reasons to believe, and science tells us that it's caused by a genetic deficiency. So if we put it on a scale, we do not know anything because we're not 100% sure, or science tells us that it has a genetic cause, then the science weighs better. Science provides us with knowledge. And if we say, well, it's caused by vaccines, well, there's no evidence for that, and there is a lot of evidence in favor for that is genetics. So it's like indeed the scale, the balance of Montaigne. Only science has evidence, and that weighs that counts for something. So the argument in favor and against goes to the claim in favor of that autism spectrum disorders are caused by genetic deficiencies. So the balance is in favor of the good reasons provided by science. But every good reason can turn out to be false, because it's a falsifiable claim. But if you have this network of claims, if you say, well, this claim is not judged in isolation, it's part of a bigger research program, then it becomes, if it's part of the hardcore of the research program, as the theories in the hardcore of the research program, it becomes more difficult and more difficult to actually falsify them. So you have indeed good reasons to believe them, and those reasons could really be so strong that it's becoming very improbable that the claims will be falsified. But you can never be 100% sure. But the skeptic has paper doubt. So good reasons are all we have, but it's also sufficient to act upon your beliefs. So I hope you now also see that we only abandon our beliefs if we have better reasons to believe something else. If you have all the evidence in favor of autism spectrum disorder being caused by genetics, by a genetic deficiency, and none whatsoever that it's caused by vaccines, then you don't give up your belief. And arguments like, well, it could be possible, that's what many people say, well, but it could be the case. No. Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence. Always ask for the evidence. Not for the proof. You know there's never any proof, but show me the evidence. And then you can have a proper debate. But if someone says, well, autism spectrum disorders are caused by aliens, well, show me the evidence. Caused by 5G, show me the evidence. Caused by vaccines, show me the evidence. So, and then you should be open-minded always. You should always be open-minded in that sense that your claims might be false, but don't just be open-minded in the sense that if someone says, well, you're not open-minded if you don't think about the possibility that you might be wrong. Yeah, I'm thinking about the possibility that I'm wrong, but that doesn't mean that I have to accept your stupid claim for which you don't have any evidence, and then you say I'm closed-minded. No, you have to provide evidence. It's just wrong to believe anything without having sufficient evidence, without having any evidence. So you should be open-minded, but you only revise your beliefs if you have evidence to the contrary of what you currently believe. So you should always be able to ask this question, could I be wrong? Could I be wrong? That might be the most important question as a scientist you could ask. And that goes for you as a scientist doing research when you want to gain more knowledge about the world, but also if you apply what psychologists have found out, if you do an intake with a new client. You might have this preconception that this person has this disorder, and you might be inclined, because the way we all work, to find evidence in favor of that. But you should ask the question, might I be wrong? And that's really important, because if you have a client and you have the wrong diagnosis, you might give this person the wrong treatment. It has huge implications that we are seeing regularity where there is none, that we have confirmation bias. And we should be aware of that. So the most important question might be, am I wrong? So we need to do several things. First of all, you have to have the guts to ask yourself this question. It's really difficult. It's really difficult to answer it in a negative. So, oh yes, I am wrong. That's really hard. Uh, so this is part of building of character. It takes character to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. But scientists have to do that all the time. If you do research, well, you might not say, you're sorry, you might just do research and your hypothesis is wrong, but don't mess around with your statistics to get some significant result when you know you're actually doing that. You're tinkering with your statistics just so you have something that shows that it's significant while you know, well, my hypothesis was just false. So it's hard to do that. So have the guts to ask yourself the question, am I wrong? And have the guts to answer that in a negative. But also, you have to have the guts to ask that of other people, of course. And if they don't have evidence, you might still be wrong. You might still be wrong if someone says, I think the world is different from the way you think it is. But if you have evidence and this person doesn't, this person still can be right, but you're not revising your beliefs before you have any evidence to the contrary. And then you have to see who's right, who has the most progressive research program. So what we also need to do then is to look at possible errors in the reasonings we might make. So we have to look at our idols, because we might not be as rational as we think we are. And basically, Hume already showed that, Bacon already showed that with his list of idols we have. Idols just being his word for what we now call biases. So we need to do that. We need to take a look into the way we jump to conclusions instead of rationally take the time and think about what we have observed, what the results of our experiments are. So we might think we are rational beings. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, the thinking human. So apparently we classify ourselves as the rational animal there is. But we might not be as rational as we think we are. What are we going to do in the next lectures? And because we might not be as rational as we think we are, in the next 6 lectures, my colleague, Michael Vlerik, will discuss many of these thinking errors humans make and the scientists might make. So we can understand that we are indeed sometimes irrational, but science has found out we can predict when we are irrational. And we can explain why we are irrational. So he's going to talk about that. And of course, how can we guard ourselves against irrationality in science? How can we make sure, or at least try to avoid making all these mistakes? Because it's not just confirmation bias. There are many biases we have that stand in the way of acquiring proper knowledge about the world. And of course, what he will do is he'll get back to things we have discussed in the 8 lectures we've done so far. And there's also a lecture 15, but that's not a one that has new content. That's one that is about the exam. So there are 15 lectures, but there are now coming up 6 lectures basically on naturalized epistemology, basically on showing how psychology is relevant to epistemology.